Geographers, welcome to week 7. So this is your last full week of class. We have one more week next week, but that's only a few days, and it's mostly devoted to taking your final examination. So for week 7, we're going to look at Southeast Asia. This is chapter 11, before proceeding to chapter 12 and the annotated chapter 13, which will be about Australia, New Zealand, and Oceania, before a glimpse into the Pacific and Antarctica. Okay, so let's begin with Southeast Asia. We can divide it into two general geographic regions. We have the mainland region, which exists from the western terrains of Myanmar all the way over to Vietnam. So we have 5 of these nations. We also have our insular region, which we constitute 6 nations, which include from anywhere from the west to the east. We have Indonesia, which represents the 4th largest nation on Earth in regarding its population, all the way out to the peninsular regions of the Philippines in the east, which sometimes can actually be regarded as an East Asian geography in itself. They certainly have connections to the cultural zones of Japan in the north, a bit more so than they do with some of the Southeast Asian geographies as we understand. So as we look into this, we'll do a little bit of a historical geographic approach as we do, and we tend to begin our introductions. And we look at Southeast Asia in terms of it being somewhat of a shatter belt region. Now, we can look at the tension of the cultural geographies between these connections to India and China in the mainland, but we can also consider the diversity of religions which exist. We have Hinduism in Singapore and in places in Bali. Otherwise, we have the largest Muslim nation in the earth in Indonesia. We have Christianity across Southeast Asian regions, particularly in the Philippines and in East Timor. And we also have Buddhism, which is the primary religion of the mainland. And we can kind of examine how these religious geographies spread from India when we consider some of the geographic structures of the physical geography of the terrains. Now, it's an important area because it's incredibly intriguing, just like any geographic region, but we consider it within the world stage as its growing importance for world trade, because we consider this as a link between the Middle East to East Asia, and Southeast Asia is perched right in the middle. So any tension which we previously considered existing between India and China, we can look into this stage as it plays out through shipping and trade and attempting to expand our interests in this region. Case in point, we look at Singapore with the Straits of Malacca, where we have a strategic geographic choke point where about anywhere from 1/5 to 1/6 of the world trade every day that's shipped across oceans goes through this particular Strait of Malacca. So European markets trying to consume goods that are coming from East Asia oftentimes have to navigate this. And China's actually tried to build an overland route to mitigate some of the importance of, so you think about trade and break of bolt point, as we talked about in the past when we looked at places like Holland. And so we can consider some of the strategic importance of a lot of confluences of interests in this region. Going forward, so we'll look a little bit about the Shatter Belt region too. We'll play that forward into the Cold War period, and we can look at some of the strategic tensions which existed between communism and so-called capitalism, West and East. And no more in particular is this played out than the Vietnam conflict. We have examples of the previous colonial history versus Vietnam, and then the American involvement, and then the resultant communist regime. Okay, guys, so we're going to move forward into Australia, Oceania, and New Zealand. Now, like the continents, it's a bit shorter than other regions, as you can tell from the amount of keywords and responsibilities. We're going to look at it. Basically, we're going to look at the physical geography of Australia, and we're going to then kind of consider how the human geography settled on these lands, as we've tended to do in this method. So we'll consider some of the unique attributes of the environmental attributes. We'll look at kind of the rain shadow effect and how the environment on the far east coast is much different than the mainland outback. Again, we'll get to look at the human geography, and so not only the peopling, from the largely British colonists, but we'll look at the indigenous peoples, or the Aboriginal peoples who've lived there for tens of thousands of years. In a similar tradition, we'll look at the European peopling of New Zealand, and we'll also look at the Polynesian peopling of New Zealand. Although the Polynesians, the Maori, currently only make about 10% of the population of New Zealand, they had extensive peopling and migrations, in the 9th and 10th century, as part of those Austronesian maritime empires that came to New Zealand. So we have an interesting dichotomy of indigenous peoples and European, in this case, Anglophile British colonists who have arrived there. And we can look at how that's played out in the environmental geography. And we can kind of look a little bit into some of their current industry and, just a little bit about economic geography. Going forward, we're going to dive into Oceania, which essentially it's tough to dive into because first off, it's all ocean, so you'd have to swim, but it's the world's largest geographic realm. So we've looked at largest variosities throughout time there. China is the largest population set. India is the fastest growing and soon to be the largest population set. It has some of the largest population density. In Europe, it had some of the largest population densities. We had Russia, which had the most expansive, sovereignty, this expansive, sprawling polity which existed in the Soviet Union. Now we have the largest terrain. So we're going anywhere from New Zealand all the way over to, believe it or not, Hawaii is included in Polynesia. So we have vast terrains, and it's largely uninhabited because it's mostly ocean. But we have a lot of incredible diversity of language groups, and we've got to consider that this area was peopled over tens of thousands of years, even before Neolithic times. So we have over 700 languages spoken in Papua New Guinea, which, for my knowledge, now you can contest me if you'd like to, or contact me, please, or maybe I'll give you an extra credit point. I believe it might be the most linguistically diverse nation in the planet, other than Nigeria. I think Papua New Guinea has more languages spoken. So consider that when you actually look at the various migration phases of people who live in between Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia, which are these rough distinctions which have subdelineated the geographic terrain. So we'll look at some of the challenges that face these unique climates, with some of the weather challenges and some of between volcanism and typhoons and, being an ocean nation. We'll also look at some of the economic and cultural isolations that can occur from being a small island economic zone and, some of the pressures to develop your industry, based upon ecotourism, and maybe some culture drain of indigenous historical culture getting kind of pressured to conform to some of the forces of globalization and commercialization, which we've seen as occurring throughout the world. Lastly, we'll touch very briefly on Antarctica, which is larger than either Europe or Australia. Now, it's largely covered by ice shelf, and the only inhabited zones are research stations. So we won't spend much time on Antarctica. Thank you, everyone. It's been a wonderful 7 weeks. Don't let your guard down and finish strong here on your final examination. Remember to get those REA4s into me by the end of this due date, and contact me if you have any questions about some final construction issues or anything regarding your grade, and we will get that handled before the issuing of those final grades next week. Thank you, everyone.